Hello everyone, so let's discuss my video about electric buses. First off, I'd like to thank everyone for all the feedback. It's really good to see how polite everyone was about their disagreement, so good job. Second, some self-critique. My video about electric buses really wasn't that great. As some people have pointed out, it felt way too shallow and not so well thought out. I agree. In general, I should have been far more thorough. This follow-up video will hopefully correct that. And I think the best way to address criticism and fill in the gaps is to address EEVblog's video response, because he brings up most of the main recurring points I saw from other people. His video is linked in the description, so feel free to check it out. The first point I'd like to address from EEVblog is the trolleybus wires.
Look at these, daggy wires. And sure, you do tend to, just ignore them after a while, but it's the same with power poles as well. If you ever lived in an area, grew up in an area with power poles, you just, tend to ignore all the power wires going everywhere. As then, if you live in a place which has underground power, and then you go back to the power lines, you really notice them. No thanks. We're better off without the wires.
So according to EEVblog, trolleybus wires cause visual pollution. I admit this point is completely subjective, but aren't we sitting on the horse backwards here? On the street view image, EEVblog points to all the wires above, saying how ugly they look. If you're bothered by that, fair enough. But what about the things below the wire? It's a sea of grey and black asphalt full of metal boxes, which is the new norm in our cities ever since mass motorization started. I feel like aesthetic considerations about trolleybus wires shouldn't be a priority. Personally, I think trolleybus wires are fine. EEVblog's second point about trolleybus wires is that they are problematic to build out due to red tape and costs.
Why don't we just install the wires? The first is practicality and infrastructure cost and the red tape to get all of this stuff to happen. You can't just go stringing up lines willy-nilly. It's not that easy.
In terms of red tape, that depends fully on local regulation. In Europe, it's generally not a problem, and it shouldn't be that much more difficult in other places either. After all, they're putting up the wires above existing right away. Unless there are some exotic local regulations, this should not be a problem. In terms of costs, well, more on that later. But you can see on EEV's screen right here how the wires are integrated into existing infrastructure, like the poles. In my original video, you could see how they use the building's facades. Trolleybus wires aren't complicated to put up. Let's remember this point for later.
Okay, so he's talking about battery fires. If that's your argument, well, diesel buses do it too, and gas buses as well. The article this year, why are Sydney buses still going up in flames and what can be done about it? There it is there. It doesn't look good, does it? And ironically, it's the batteries in these diesel buses that are a good proportion of the fires in this particular case. And then there's the gas bus fires as well. So if diesel bus batteries catch on fire and electric bus batteries can catch on fire as well, you're just arguing semantics, really. There's just no point.
EEVblog dismisses my concern over electric bus fires by stating that other buses can burn down too, in large part due to the battery, so it's all semantics at that point. I think he missed my point here, and in a way also proved it. Of course other types of buses can also catch on fire, and of course the battery is a large part of it. The thing is, an electric bus battery is much bigger. While I don't think electric buses catching fire is the most immediate problem with them, electric vehicle fires are starting to become a problem. To quote from this NBC article, on April 17th, when firefighters responded to a 911 call at around 9:30 p.m, they came upon a Tesla Model S that had crashed, killing 2 people and was now on fire. They extinguished it, but then a small flare shot out of the bottom of the charred hog. Firefighters quickly put out those flames. Not long after, the car reignited for a third time. According to the article, the firefighters ended up using 28,000 gallons of water to put this one car fire out, which is the amount they use in a month, and what an average American home uses in 2 years. In contrast, a combustion vehicle fire takes around 300 gallons. According to Tesla's first responder guide, putting out a battery fire will take between 3 and 8,000 gallons, or 11 to 30,000 liters. So in the best case scenario, you need 10 times more water to put the car out. Tesla's minimum amount is already more than most water tenders can carry. Water tenders are firefighting vehicles specifically designed to carry a lot of water. 3,000 gallons is the capacity of the biggest ones. And this nets you a whole new world of problems. What if an accident happens far away from fire stations and hydrants? What if multiple electric cars catch fire in a pileup on the highway, or God forbid an electric bus? You get the idea. So my point wasn't the existence of a fire risk, rather the severity of it. This was a minor point of mine though, since battery bus fires are not common. Moving on. Speaking of batteries, their construction and disposal are very polluting, not to mention the occasional slave labor involved in the mining of the necessary rare earth metals.
Okay, if you're going to use this argument about electric buses, you have to do the same and more so for electric cars. Yeah, good luck with that. The electric car future or revolution is already here. Sure, it's a fair point to bring up, and we need to probably do better in this regard, but it's not an argument against them. And that's just silly. These things can be fixed.
EEVblog makes 2 points here. A, if I criticize slave labor for BEVs, then I have to do the same for electric cars, and good luck with that, since the electric car future is already here. First off, will I criticize electric cars? Hell yeah, I think they suck, though they suck a bit less than combustion cars. Also, good luck with that. You know, it's possible to criticize things even if they're becoming widespread and popular. EEV's second point, I guess point B then, is the following. The slave labor involving battery production is not an argument against BEVs because it can be fixed. The position that slave labor in battery production can be eliminated in the future doesn't automatically give us permission to invest into such an industry in the present. And of course, most of our gadgets contain rare earth metals, so in a way we are already complicit in slave labor. The crucial difference though is that current gadgets don't really have a better alternative, unless you seriously consider living the Amish life or something, while electric buses do have that alternative, in the form of trolleybuses which have comparable costs and need significantly less rare earth metals. Further problem is that electric buses aren't a good option where public transit is needed the most, i.e. developing countries. Electric buses are much more expensive as it turns out, costing up to twice as much as diesel buses.
So it's not just about the lower initial price here, and this 100% capacity thing, like you're going to have only 50% the capacity here. As I said, we're not starting a city from scratch and going, oh, we're going to buy 500 buses or 1,000 buses. You've already got all the existing bus transport infrastructure in place. You've already got the roads, the buses are already running, diesel or gas-powered buses. The argument is whether or not you want to replace them with electric buses. And the private company that I visited, they've done the test, they've run the numbers on it, and they said, yeah, we're going electric buses. Thank you very much.
EEVblog says my developing world example doesn't work because the cities have pre-existing rolling stock which then can be replaced by BEVs, which are better on the long run. In the specific situation he described, sure. Within the dichotomy of BEV and diesel bus, BEVs can make sense. We are in agreement here. But in situations where there isn't a well-developed system, when there's just a small rudimentary network, then the main priority becomes adding more capacity. Most developing countries don't have a large pre-existing transit network that you can just transition into electric buses. You don't even need to go to Africa for such examples. Kiev and most major cities in Ukraine are in dire need of additional buses, or were before the war. In the wake of multiple revolutions and economic crises, in the last 30 years, municipal bus systems were abandoned due to a simple lack of funds. Private carriers took over most bus transit with woefully inadequate quality and capacities. They had to because very often there was nothing else. And this problem exists even today, though less severe. For example, Kiev has around 800 municipal buses as a 2.9 million city. In contrast, Budapest has around 1,500 as a 1.7 million city. Kiev would need at least 1,000 buses yesterday. The quickest solution is to buy buses with the lowest upfront cost, even though they're more expensive on the long run. As I've alluded to in my original video, sheer upkeep is not the only thing we have to factor in here. The lack of public transit can cause invisible losses that are very hard to measure, but they are there nonetheless. In the case of Kiev and cities like it, BEVs are a good on-paper solution, but city or even state budgets are not infinite, especially when it comes to public transit. BEVs might be a better financial decision long-term, but a bad socio-economic decision short and mid-term, plus the aforementioned ethical concerns. On top of this, to maintain the same capacity, you generally need 10 to 20% more BEVs than trolley or diesel buses, depending on the charging method. More on that later. So how is Kiev solving its public transit deficit? Well, the municipal operator plans on purchasing 137 trolley buses, or did so anyway before the war. Additionally, in 2020, they bought 200 diesel buses, and in 2021 they announced a tender for 100 more. Although now they'll just be using captured Russian armor or something. So if you're in dire need of a public transit system, you should focus on putting as many vehicles on the lines as you can. Also, since diesel buses aren't much more expensive to maintain than electric buses, we can take a look at this 2020 case study from Shenzhen, China, where the entire urban bus fleet was converted to BEVs. According to their findings, without state subsidies, diesel buses have a lower cost of ownership over the bus lifetime of 8 years. Now, diesel buses will catch up sometime after the 8-year mark, but their upfront cost is still much lower. So for developing countries that are in need of a bus transit system, most often the cheapest option is the most reasonable questionable. The fact that electric buses will compensate for their costs in a decade is little solace to the people who won't have access to good public transit for years to come. Whereas if you bought more diesel buses for the same amount of money, you could have covered a larger area with more lines and served more people. It's nice that electric buses make financial sense after a decade, but that's not enough. Public transportation is more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's transportation for the public. People in the EV community seem to forget that sometimes. So in my view, if you have two options for transit and one is somewhat more expensive on the long run but serves a lot more people, then people should take precedence over sheer budget numbers. Imagine some city hall representative showing up to an impoverished area with no public transit and telling people the good news that the city has finally invested in public transit. We have invested in electric buses, but they won't be running here just yet. Since they are very expensive, we could only buy about half the needed amount for now, with the second half coming in 5 years. So just 5 more years of deprivation and poverty and you'll have public transit. Why didn't you buy cheaper buses and cover everyone instead? Well... absolutely. And the vast majority of traffic pollution is coming from cars. The more buses you have, ideally the more cars you can take off the road. Even if all your buses are diesel, that's still a huge net reduction in total emission, which then lowers the social cost of deaths from pollution. As I've mentioned before, Budapest has around 1,500 diesel buses in regular operation, compared to 690,000 cars in the city, plus 585,000 cars in the suburbs. If you're aiming to reduce pollution, you want to cut back on car use first. Diesel buses are almost nothing compared to individual motor traffic, and they give a net reduction in emissions, thus a net reduction in social costs. To sum up, I agree that BEVs can be more cost-effective on the long run. The data seems to bear this out. But the numbers aren't that far apart, plus I think we must consider the social aspect as well. We are doing public transit for the people, not for accountants. Wait, did I just imply that accountants aren't people? So for developing countries, I believe diesel buses are hands down the best way to start. For developed countries though, that can afford more expensive hardware, it's the autonomous trolleybus, assuming other forms of transit don't make sense on the particular route, such as trams, trains, and so on. So in terms of trolleybuses, EEVblog opens with two arguments. One, I shoot down my previous argument because autonomous trolleybuses also have batteries which can also catch fire.
This one is interesting. He's shooting down his own trolleybus argument, of course, by saying, oh, yeah, use these autonomous trolleybuses which have a smaller battery in them. Well, if you're going to make your bus electric, you've got the same battery fire problems that he's talked about. What, that's suddenly not a problem anymore because it's a smaller battery. The buses I looked at had 328 kilowatt hour battery packs in them, as opposed to my Ioniq EV, which has a 38 kilowatt hour, so roughly order of magnitude bigger battery.
Yes, autonomous trolleybuses can also catch fire, but don't you think there's a difference between a 30 and 400 kilowatt-hour battery fire? This isn't a Boolean yes battery / no battery situation, we're in a spectrum here. The more you scale up the battery, the more severe your problems can get. EEVblog's second point is the following.
Actually putting the wire infrastructure in place for all this sort of stuff. It's a huge cost, it's a huge amount of red tape, it takes years and years, whereas electric buses, you simply just drive them out. It's a complete no-brainer.
According to EEV's thought process, if autonomous trolleybus equals yes battery and yes wires, and electric bus equals yes battery and no wires, then electric bus better because no wires. Once again, things are a bit more complicated than that. Having a bigger traction battery can cause problems and complications that wouldn't be present with a smaller traction battery, or at least they would be far more manageable. For example, a bigger battery means more weight.
Last year, SEPTA bought a bunch of battery-powered buses, right?
Oh, they sure did.
And they decided to deploy them on former trolley bus routes. That's where they had electric buses that draw power from overhead lines.
Right. And they spit on the graves. Yes.
Yes. And what happened is apparently they had to take the buses out of service last February and didn't tell anyone. And because all the frames cracked because the batteries are too heavy. What they could have used were the overhead lines.
The wires are already up. We don't even have to say put up some goddamn wires. They're already up.
This was just incredibly embarrassing that like they bought these new high-tech buses that use worse technology than what they already had. You know, it's more extractive. They need these big lithium batteries as opposed to just some copper wires over the street. And they broke just immediately.
I would also like to add that even if we'll have lighter batteries in the future, we most likely won't be able to just plug them into our existing electric buses. They were designed with the battery weight in mind, so reducing it might lead to erratic driving characteristics or the bus tipping over in sharper curves or something. Just something to keep in mind. Aside from battery weight, there is a further issue you have to consider when running buses off a big battery and nothing else. A few years ago, Moscow replaced all its trolley buses with battery electric buses, and then winter came. Turns out batteries are very much susceptible to this thing outside the showroom called weather. If it's too cold or too hot, batteries lose efficiency. Not only that, but they also have to power the heating or air conditioning, both of which are massive power whores. Trolleybuses solve this problem by having a separate, centralized power source which is not susceptible to the weather, unless it's a tornado or something. So it seems to me that by forcing the power source on board of the bus, we're creating all these completely avoidable problems for no good reason. Since trolleybuses and BEVs cost around the same, including the cost of setting up their infrastructure, more on that in the end, the only remaining potential argument for battery buses is maintenance costs. And oh boy, let's just get into it, I guess.
And here's a cost-benefit analysis of electric city buses. This has got some interesting stuff, including trolley buses. Now, of course, you have 0 units for natural gas and 0 units for diesels. You don't have to maintain the grid and charging systems. But look at this trolley bus, 326 compared to 5. That's the cost of the electrical grid and maintaining the wires and the catenary system and the whole, maintaining the whole show for trolley buses. So his main argument for trolley buses is shot down right there.
Wow, electric bus versus trolley bus infrastructure maintenance is 5 to 326? If that's true, that would be huge. Well, man, I looked through this document and Comic Sans title, spelling mistakes, no references. There is a table where they list components of a diesel bus, and then under diesel bus it says yes in every line, and under electric bus it says no. Some very serious research you got there. Besides the effects of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, electrica buses is the most promising for the urban transit due to the space occupied by the cars and bicycles to transport the same number of passengers. Oh, so we're anti-bicycle now? Also, if we decide to take the graphs at face value, lifetime cost of EL versus diesel are actually not that different. Lifetime cost of EL versus diesel in health. Okay, what emission standards are we talking about? Because that would be one of the crucial points for this comparison. Also, I have a sneaking suspicion that they haven't factored in the reduction in healthcare costs due to having less cars on the road on the account of having public transit. Or have they? Who knows? There aren't any sources. And wait, it says healthcare / cost of carbon. What is the cost of carbon? Is it emission quotas? Okay, so this graph, electric bus versus other transport units. Once again, where did these numbers come from? There aren't any references. I assume all of this is in euro. They specify for BEVs and diesel, but not for CNG and trolley. How is maintaining trolley wires 65 times more expensive than electric bus infrastructure? How big of a network are we talking about? How long is the trolleybus line? How many of them are there? Also, how many chargers are we talking about? If trolley infrastructure really was 65 times more expensive to maintain, then how come poorer Eastern European countries can afford to run trolleys? What is up with this paper anyway? What is this? Case study of GSP line Echo 1? Okay, E-bus versus diesel bus APO 5, I guess that's Cyrillic for Euro 5. Daily exploitation cost of diesel and electric bus. Okay, we got tiers per day, daily maintenance, registration per day, water, electric per day. So the total for diesel is 396.44 euro per day, and for electric it's 201 UPO. Okay, Dave, I don't think you should be using this study for anything really. In the next part of his video, EV did a positive versus negative list, just like I did in my original video. And that was a mistake of mine. I shouldn't have made such a list comparison, because these things can be very manipulative. Through deliberate manipulation, or just unconscious bias, I might end up overemphasizing the negatives for the things I don't like, and the positives for the things I do like. This is not based on any hard data, as you yourself point out. At best, this would just be some food for thought. At worst, manipulation. It's very similar to what PragerU does, for example, and I should have been more responsible. You did the same thing though, to which I can levy the same criticism. These lists of ours aren't objective and don't prove anything by themselves. I believe I did find a more reliable source for the costs of battery versus trolley buses. Let's check out this article and cost comparison by Martin Wright at the Urban Transport magazine. He writes, in the last few years, transport planners have increasingly been concerned about the need to move towards a low carbon / zero carbon future. Even for cities with extensive electric metro and light rail services, the aim is to replace their fossil fuels in their bus systems. The most popular answer has been to look at the battery electric bus. On the face of it, this seems such a simple simple and attractive solution. Just buy the bus and, as the Americans would say, it's good to go. If anybody in a city with trolleybuses suggests that the trolleybus system could play a significant role, battery bus advocates will point to the BEV and say, look, no wires. But in real life there are few magic solutions. The proposition that BEVs are much simpler and cheaper to install than trolleybuses may well be illusory. After all, there is so much in common between BEVs and battery trolleybuses. Traction motor, power electronics for control of speed and braking, batteries and chargers are shared in common. And wait for weight, power consumption will be very similar. The main difference is how power is transferred and stored, but this does not seem so fundamentally different that it should lead to a significant difference in the capital investment required. Wright compares three systems here: BEV with overnight depot charging, BEV with en route charging, and battery trolleybus. Of course, such comparisons can be difficult, as he correctly points out. It is not possible to produce conclusive proof that one solution or the other is better, whatever that would mean to an individual planner. First, obtaining precise costs for the individual components is very difficult because of issues such as commercial confidentiality. Moreover, much will depend on the individual local circumstances of a particular city and specific routes. What does emerge from the following is that large-scale electrification using battery buses can require capital expenditure of a similar order of magnitude as for an equivalent trolleybus system using battery trolleybuses with in-motion charging. Comparing Toronto's depot charging system, Vancouver's en route charging system, and also Vancouver's battery trolleybus system, Wright comes up with the following numbers. As you can see, based on this calculation, a battery trolleybus system setup costs around the same as an electric bus system. This article is of course linked in the description, so if you want to go over the exact details of how this was calculated, feel free to read through it. BEVs, whether charged en route or in the depot, need a lot of very costly infrastructure. Most of it is invisible to the average person though, while trolleybus infrastructure is much more apparent. This might cause some people to believe that the latter is much more costly than the former, which is simply not the case. Wright's conclusion is as follows. As all three options are of a similar order of magnitude, it is important that transit planners, and in particular political decision makers, be aware that BEVs are by no means the cheap and simple solution that many seem to think, and conversely that, contrary to appearances, an installation using battery trolleybuses with in-motion charging can be financially competitive with battery electric buses. So, in the end, we can say that battery trolleybus systems are very much competitive with BEVs. Even in smaller towns, mind you. In the Czech Republic, Ústí nad Labem is a 90,000 inhabitant city with 11 trolleybus lines. As a side note, there used to be tram lines, but those were dismantled during Soviet times. As you can see, even in a city of 90,000, trolleybus lines or even tram lines can make sense. Moreover, there is also Jihlava, a 50,000 inhabitant city with 7 trolleybus lines. Trolleybuses can make sense even in smaller towns, not just larger cities. They are far more versatile than most people would think. Alright, so it's a tie, right? Seems like BEVs and autonomous trolleybuses are about par in terms of costs, so cities and towns are free to choose which one makes the most sense in their particular area. Right? Not so fast. The one huge glaring issue with electric buses is the large-scale use of rare earth metals, which I believe is completely indefensible. Today we have a choice between two viable systems. Both contain rare earth metals, but one significantly less than the other. Therefore, as a consequentialist, I say let's invest in the one that contains less. That way we don't generate as much demand for rare earth metals, which ultimately means we contribute less to modern-day slavery. Dave just shrugged this point off like it didn't matter, which was a bit disappointing to be honest. This is a big reason why I don't like electric cars either. Aside from not solving any of the main problems of individual transit, such as space and efficiency. I feel like many electric vehicle advocates tend to focus on the tech and not the people behind it. It's nice to have a shiny new electric car, but the materials for it came from people working in slavery-like conditions, including children, for a few dollars per day without any regard for work safety. And the idea that one day we will develop batteries that won't need rare earth metals, therefore it's okay to invest in EV systems now, is something that I can't accept. It's this smug tech bro attitude of just hand-waving concerns. Yeah, slavery, whatever. Elon will just invent some tech magic and solve it, I guess, don't worry about it. Even if we know for certain that we will have practical rare earth metal-free traction batteries in, say, 5 years already, imagine going down to the mines, working for BEV manufacturers, and telling the miners, hey folks, guess what? For now you might be suffering under horrible conditions extracting the materials for our environmentally friendly electric buses, but soon we'll have batteries that won't need them. That means you only have to work in this hell for 5 more years. Isn't technology wonderful? Let's be ethical and responsible and minimize human suffering now, not in some hypothetical future or even near future. As far as I'm concerned, everything else is just an excuse. But really, my overarching problem with electric buses is that they are very often used as a fake solution in order to ignore systemic problems. Our cities are ridden with pollution, noise, and over-motorization that ruined our social spaces, but many politicians would rather just have nicer buses running on the same old system without ever touching on the status quo of car dependency. You know, instead of a diesel bus, there's now an electric bus stuck in the 8-lane traffic jam in the city center. We did it, folks. Our public transit is now zero emission. Alright, so this was my follow-up video on electric buses. Hopefully I answered your questions and clarified my own position a bit more. Thank you once again for all the feedback on the original video and for keeping things civil. And of course, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and do check out my Patreon if you appreciate my content and want to support me in making it. And I'll be seeing you next time.